Hello, everybody. My name is Jessie Lang, and we are here for Hot Topic Thursday. Hot Topic is when members of Open New York get together to talk about anything and everything pro-housing. We are also happy to welcome some friends from some other groups whose values align with Open New York's mission and who are really knowledgeable about the topic that we're discussing today, which is going to be taking a housing first approach in addressing homelessness. So just to get started, we're just going to do some introductions. If everyone could please introduce themselves, maybe I'll just kind of call out the squares on my screen. Olivia, do you want to get started?
Sure. Hi, I'm Olivia Killingsworth, and I've been involved with Open New York for about 1.5 to 2 years now. I'm also a volunteer member of Open Hearts Initiative, which is how I know our other panelist, Shams. We all met when we started working to support the residents of the Lucerne Hotel on the Upper West Side, where I live, when they were relocated from a shelter to that hotel in the middle of COVID.
Shams, why don't you go next?
I'm Shams, a.k.a. the Homeless Hero, and I'm just here.
Cool. Bobby.
Hi, I'm Bobby. I live in Ridgewood. I'm a member of Open New York. I also work with Democratic Socialists of America, New York City branch. And I've been involved for a number of years in homelessness related policy and advocacy, to some extent here in New York, but more so actually out in Olympia and Seattle, Washington, when I lived in the Pacific Northwest. So yeah, happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
And Asia.
Hi, I'm Asia Thomas. I am the Director of Organizing at Open New York, and I am a born and raised New Yorker, as you can hear from my accent.
Great. So we are just going to get into some questions about this topic so that we can learn more about it. Why don't we just get started by defining what is a housing first approach and what does it look like in practice? Olivia, do you want to take the lead on answering that?
Sure. So housing first is an approach mainly targeted at people who are experiencing chronic homelessness. And basically the approach is to give the person housing first before requiring them to do anything else. Basically, you get them into housing, permanent housing, as quickly as possible. And then there are supportive services offered on a voluntary basis, but there's basically no requirement other than that. And it's an alternative to this model that has been mostly the model in the US and a lot of other developed countries of a housing readiness model, where an individual has to maybe move through several steps and prove that they're ready for housing before they get to move into permanent housing, either from the streets to a shelter, to transitional housing. Housing first just skips all that and says, you put the person in their own apartment and then you offer services wrapped around that.
Okay. And Shams, maybe we can turn to you next. Can you tell us a little bit about what is kind of the status quo right now in New York City, and what is the lived experience of a person experiencing homelessness, and whether a housing first approach is used at all right now?
Yeah, so can you hear me good?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. So basically the status quo is the same status quo that helped establish America, which is rooted in the slave experience. And coming up from slavery, our housing policies is based, our homelessness crisis and our housing policies are the results of systemic, structural, and institutional racism. So we have decades upon decades of policies that basically didn't center the humanity of, the majority of Black or brown people who are negatively impacted by housing insecurity and homelessness. So clearly, as tradition, there's never really been a policy, a housing first policy. And what has happened in this other way of dealing with things where that Olivia was talking about is what we've seen is the development of this whole ecosystem that is fueled by nonprofits and just a government that was like just making things worse for the people impacted by housing insecurity and homelessness. So what we have pushed for the mayor in our forum that we did, you know, when we had the mayoral candidates, one of the things we asked for, would they adopt the housing first policy? And all of the mayoral candidates agreed to it. And so now the engagement with this particular mayor, now that one of those mayors, Mayor Adams, is the mayor, the engagement that I know I'm having is centered on more towards getting people.
Oh,
Oh.
I think we lost them.
I think we might have lost Shams. We'll wait.
Am I going too long?
Oh, you kind of cut out for a minute. Maybe if you could, you cut off when you were telling us what you are kind of trying to push the current mayor in the direction of. Maybe you could just finish that thought.
Yes. So we're pushing him and trying to support him in even in being able to move and transition into a housing first situation. So quickly, there's going to be an experimentation. Maybe I shouldn't be saying this right now because they didn't say it, but there's going to be an experimentation of getting people off the streets and into housing. There is a search right now for certain type of single room facilities that could serve as either permanent or transitional housing, but it's going to be a move away from going into congregate settings. And that's where, so we don't have a housing, well, let's say we didn't come into this with a housing first policy, but this mayor, from my understanding and dealings with them, is committed to a housing first policy.
Okay. Well, that's really good to hear. It sounds like that'll certainly be a step in the right direction. So I'm glad to hear that.
Oh, sorry, I end up talking.
No worries. So are there any other places that are using this approach? Bobby, I don't know if maybe you want to take this question. I know you said that you've worked in other places.
Yeah, there was another guest who was going to join us who probably could answer this question better than at least me. But so if Olivia and Shams want to dive in here at some point, feel free to. Yeah, so Seattle and Portland, Oregon, I'm a little familiar with approaches to homelessness in those cities. I don't want to say that those cities have been successful yet in ameliorating their homelessness crises. I don't think that the numbers quite would justify such a conclusion yet, but I think that those cities are on the right path. Both of them have passed progressive income taxes to create dedicated revenue streams specifically for creating permanent supportive housing, both subsidizing the capital cost for building that housing, but then also providing the services on an annual basis. And I think something that is unique about the strategies in those two cities is that both Seattle and Portland have assumed a regional approach in addressing homelessness as opposed to just a municipal or city level approach. And I think the regional approach holds a lot of promise, and I think it's also a lot more equitable and fairer than a municipal approach. It recognizes that wealthier, whiter suburbs also have to contribute their fair share in addressing homelessness, and also recognizes that a lot of times it's those suburbs that are ultimately most responsible for homelessness crises in the first place, as those are places that have the most exclusionary zoning laws and tend to have the weakest social safety nets. So I would suggest people pay attention to some of the policy shifts in Seattle and Portland over the next few years. I think the most famous or the most well-known example of a successful housing first model in the US comes from Utah, which is funny. I was just talking to Olivia, we were just texting earlier about how Utah is oddly progressive in certain respects. And I think this is one of those respects. Over the period of a decade or so, Utah decreased chronic homelessness by 91% through a housing first model. Chronic homelessness, there's still more temporary bouts of homelessness in Utah, certainly. So I don't know if Olivia or Shams would like to dive in on this question. I didn't do a whole lot of research myself before, but yeah, if anyone else wants to contribute, please feel free.
I would just, all of those are excellent examples. And one thing I might add is the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, worked together with the Department of Veteran Affairs. And over the course of 10 years, they were able to cut veteran homelessness in half by implementing a mostly housing first approach and really prioritizing getting veterans who were experiencing chronic homelessness into permanent supportive housing and funding the building of permanent supportive housing. So they had a very successful outcome there. I mean, obviously it's still a problem, as with most of these other examples, but it's been very successful. One example from outside the US is Finland. Finland implemented a housing first approach. And although, as Bobby said, as with most places, there's still issues with temporary housing instability, they were able to really significantly reduce the incidence of chronic homelessness. And basically now, there just is very few, if at all, any examples of people sleeping rough or sleeping out on the street. Yeah. That even if they don't have permanent housing to get to yet, Finland has built a system of sort of emergency or transitional shelters before they move people quickly into back into permanent housing. And one other thing I wanted to add, just to kind of tie back into what Shams said about how systemic racism plays into housing insecurity and historic policies towards homelessness, is that I feel like this is one of the examples of the ways in which systemic racism against Black and brown people hurts everybody. It hurts white people as well, because by the numbers, white people are still, percentage-wise, the majority overall of people who are experiencing homelessness in the United States. Mm-hmm. But of course, Black and brown people are overrepresented in the homeless population relative to their, shares of the population nationwide. And basically, the sort of policies the way in which we've dealt with homelessness and treating it as if it's an individual problem and rather than a systemic problem, and has sort of contributed to these policies and this what Shams referred to as a sort of a nonprofit shelter industrial complex sort of getting out of hand and hurting everybody. So yeah.
Yeah, I think those are some really important points. Shamsa, if you're still with us, is there anything that you wanted to add? Maybe not. I think that he was having some connection issues, but we'll see if he pops back on.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
All right. Apologies to you all.
No worries.
So did anybody, I didn't hear anything really, but did anybody cite this new article coming out of Houston?
Oh
no. Why don't you tell us about that?
Read it.
Yeah, well, I didn't read the whole thing, but I got basic information. And there in Houston, they're testing the model of housing first policy, and they're seeing real success with it. So I know I spoke to the mayor about it, and I think the mayor may have said something publicly about it, but he's actually going to travel down there and talk to the mayors down there and see what that program looks like. I think there's challenges here in New York City just by the mere mass of the homeless population already sheltered, and those on the streets, and those who have not even come up under the counts. So we don't even know the real numbers.
Yeah.
And then in addition to that, it's not that necessarily that we don't have the potential housing stock to satisfy the population. I mean, we do need a lot in terms of supportive services, but to transition into that model is not like an overnight fix, although that's something that we would want to do. And so I think we can phase into that if we begin to look at the homeless population we have in shelters on the streets and begin to get those people housed. And then as we start to reduce that population and create better environments for the homeless population, we'll probably do better. So quickly, several things I feel and I felt and I am attacking is one, the voucher system, because we found that because of the bureaucratic barriers that it's kept a lot of people in the shelter system for too long. And so in attacking that and streamlining that process, we'll be able to reduce a person's time in shelter, get them into housing quicker. The other thing is to form a better relationship with landlords who are open to vouchers now that vouchers have become a little more viable income opportunity for them, and create a relationship where they understand that the faces of homelessness is not the horror stories that they would imagine, and that many of us can be productive members of any community. And so, of course, there's way more to that, along with the taking converted hotels into supportive housing units and finding other ways to open up that housing stock. We're doing that. And so, but it's something that requires all hands on deck, meaning the medical community, the advocates, the impacted people, and regular community members, because that's the other negative, is that communities, quite frankly, don't want homelessness in their community or formerly homeless people in their communities. And we have to start to change the narratives and change the way we engage communities in order to make it easier for us to be able to get people housed first, rather than warehoused in these congregate death traps.
Yeah, that is so important. It sounds like there's a lot of work to do, definitely, but a lot of opportunities to make it happen that you've described.
I would just want to say that, just to piggyback on that last part that you mentioned, Shams, homelessness does not mean that someone is a criminal. Homelessness does not mean that someone is now lazy, or it doesn't even mean that someone is uneducated or doesn't have family or any other stereotype that is associated with this word, with this stain that's on someone's record by saying that they have experienced homelessness. Immediately when people are brave enough to say that out loud, they're met with this uneasy head tilt by people like, or it's the judgment is automatically there. And unfortunately, that goes into the neighborhood. That goes into, again, I don't want them in my next to me. I don't want them in my school. I don't want them and them argue. We are all New Yorkers. We all share the same space. And so we need to make sure that we're not only incorporating, infusing everyone, and every borough is doing their part to build more and to bring people into the fold, into the community, but that we're also having these conversations and educating our children and people and congregations about what the actual facts are about homelessness, and that it's people who are surfing on your couch. There are people who have been living on your couch for how many years because they cannot afford to live on their own. They are technically homeless. That is a form of homelessness, and we need to address it. There are so many people like that living in New York. There are people who are, of a certain age in New York City who still have roommates, not because they want to, but because it's just that not affordable for a lot of New Yorkers. And you come to New York, and some come with a big dream, and unfortunately New York says we're also going to haze you and we want all of your money. And so give me your money and your firstborn child, and then maybe you can live somewhere. But that also comes with a compromise. Do you live here, or do you live far away from work? Do you live far away from school? What do you have in your community that actually makes you feel welcomed and feel a part and feel connected to that? And so I think, again, having these conversations and educating the public on this is so incredibly important, not just to talk about homelessness, but to incorporate that with, transit, incorporate that with building more, incorporate that with changing zoning laws, incorporate that with this this issue, this stigma goes in with so many other topics that we need to really make sure that the voices are being heard across the platform.
Yeah, I think that's so important. Bobby, did you have something to add to that?
Yeah, just to contribute to this conversation on Houston's successes, I think the successes there hinge in large part on a very successful utilization of rental vouchers in the private market. And I think to a large extent that success can be attributed to the fact that Houston just has lower rents than New York City. And so the value of that voucher goes a lot farther. Those vouchers are a lot more competitive.
So can you all hear me?
Houston's housing market than New York's housing market. So I just wanted to contribute that.
That's a really good point.
I think and that's important to understand the value of vouchers, especially in a place like New York. And then also if we're thinking about equity, when I talk to developers and property owners, there's so many negatives. They are negatives, but there are so many things that make it unappealable for them to try and service the supportive housing community. And they're asking, like, how do we do this? How does it make sense? And even the nonprofits are finding this difficult because, whether it's getting the financing or being able to get the city and the state to take on some of that risk. And there's always risk with that. There's just a fear to enter into that marketplace, even with the initiative that we just got established, even with the money that's out there. They're saying, even with the money, I just can't take the risk. I can't put $500,000 up to get it started, only for the city or the state to pull out and don't cover the other end. So there are things that we have to do as people invest, stakeholders in this, to try and create a better deal structure, or to engage the financial institutions that can make building supportive housing a more viable option with the cost associated with construction and stuff like that. And then on the other end, there's other issues with how these things are paid for. So a private developer might not look at the idea of doing supportive housing, or a nonprofit who does not get paid from the state, meaning they're providing medical services. So it leaves out a lot of people who are doing great work, but they may not be able to finance or get into that space. So those are other things that I think that in trying to look for solutions or look for ways to adopt the housing first strategy, we have to kind of like see where those barriers to doing that are, and then develop solutions that make it more viable for stakeholders to invest themselves in it.
Yeah, that's another really important point. So, I mean, thinking about all of us, where we are all advocates, this is something that we want to advocate for from a policy lens. We want to also advocate for changing people's opinions and maybe prejudices about homelessness. But for anybody watching this video, how do you think that everyday New Yorkers, or somebody who is feels strongly about this issue but maybe doesn't really know what to do right now, what can they do to get involved with that? Olivia, do you want to get us started with that?
Yeah, so there are so many opportunities to get involved, even just as an individual. There's a lot of advocacy that Shams is involved with, and that a whole bunch of other groups that Open New York is associated with, that are involved with, around making the voucher system in New York City better, There are always opportunities for individual advocacy around various new supportive housing developments. I know Open New York members just showed up in great numbers for a development in Hell's Kitchen recently, and that was really great to see. And I think there's also just opportunities, just when you're in conversation with friends or family and the topic comes up, just to go back to what Asia was talking about, that, you know, housing first and permanent supportive housing are definitely things that we need, but they're targeted at a fraction of the homeless population that is experiencing chronic homelessness. And as Asia pointed out, most people who are experiencing homelessness, they're not actually mentally ill. They may not actually really have substance abuse problems. Really, all they need is just housing. They just need safe, affordable housing. Homelessness is a housing problem. It's not caused by mental illness. It's not caused by substance abuse. It's caused by a lack of affordable housing. And that's really the baseline problem that we're trying to address with all of these policies. So I think that's one thing people can always be doing, is asking questions and helping others to understand that really basic fact.
Yeah, definitely. Does anyone want to add to that about what people should be doing? Asia, do you have anything to add?
Get involved. There are groups, there are, you know, like Olivia said, there are groups, there are people that you can, there are so many entryways into this conversation, and to be supportive. And support doesn't look like now you have a full-time job of being an activist, and everyone is not a Shams, everyone is not an Olivia or Bobby or Jesse, but everyone does have time to vote for your elected official who cares about policies and changing things for the better. You do have time to write a letter to your elected official, which will take you 2 minutes, to share a tweet that supports these different causes. You know, July is Homeless Awareness Month.
Well, Shams, we can also tell folks to support the Fair Chance for Housing legislation that's in the city.
Oh yeah, let's do that.
Yeah,
but it is also Homeless Awareness Month in July. So whatever you do, whatever you are part of, you know, whether it's a phone call, whether it's, again, like Olivia said, just being aware and educating yourself and spreading the right narrative to your friends and family, to your kids, is extremely important. And so, you know, find those groups on Twitter. We're on Twitter, we're on Facebook, we're on Instagram, and all those different places. But become part of the solution, not the problem.
Yeah, totally. And, you know, just because we have a month to think about this doesn't mean that homelessness only exists for 1 month. There's 11 other months where people experiencing chronic homelessness also need our support. So,
so if you don't mind me interjecting.
Sure.
So yeah, so basically under the premise of why there's a July Homeless Rights Month, the idea was for last year for groups that are normally just doing different actions or things, 12 months out of the year, to actually center, like work together concentrated within 1 month, doing whatever actions they felt were good, that they could do. But just the idea of everyone doing something and centering under a banner was good. Fortunately, I got kicked out of my own event, but what I will say is this: I think one of the things that we do have to do is we have to begin to start centering the impacted, the people impacted, in ways that are empowering, not just calling them for a press conference or for a photo shoot, or putting them in these token positions in these organizations that don't allow them to actualize themselves in these spaces. Some of us may come and we don't know anything, but being in certain circles allow us to grow and develop and to be more productive in that space. But if we're never given those opportunities, then we're just like my brother Larry Thomas, who's running around begging for a job, still going out every Thursday with Coalition for the Homeless, delivering food, but no one's offering him a sustainable job. No one's helping this guy pay his bills. And this is our great advocate, Larry Thomas. And so I would like to see a lot of people graduate like me, who is now a board of trustee member for Project Renewal, the same shelter I came from. Everybody has that same potential. But if those of you who are in these leadership positions and in these executive positions and in these board director positions, if you are not seeing the value in the people that you claim to serve, then you are doing all of us a disservice, especially here in New York City, where 90% of the people that you claim to serve are Black and brown, stigmatized, marginalized, traumatized, dehumanized people since the days of slavery, emancipation with no reparations. We have to change that. And it shouldn't have to start with us, because we got the privilege of our Blackness and our brownness and our experience, but you have more privilege in the fact that you were able to inherit reap the benefits of those who profited off of slavery. So my thing is, if we're in this space today and you have that privilege, reach out to the people you claim to serve, lift them up, bring them up, help them become sustainable and empowered, not just by putting them on a Zoom, not just by inviting them to a press conference, but by saying, here, look, we're going to start you here, but we're going to help you develop there.
Yeah, obviously these conversations need to just be a start to the work, and then we need to all put ourselves to work so that we can actually fix these problems. That's such an important point. So thank you. So maybe just to kind of round out this conversation, you know, I do want to think about how this approach fits in with Open New York's overall mission for abundant housing. Bobby, do you want to say a few words about how you think that this all kind of fits together?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, I'm already unmuted. Yeah, I mean, I would just continue my comment earlier about Houston, maybe, that the reason that Houston has been so successful, I think, is that there's just lower market rate rents in Houston because of Houston's liberalized zoning laws, and so vouchers go pretty far in that city. So I think a key to the success of Section 8 and also the city's voucher program, City FEPS, is just increasing the overall housing supply so that voucher recipients can compete better in our housing market. And I would also just add, of course, that zoning reform does not just pertain to new market rate housing, it also pertains to new subsidized and permanent supportive housing, mixed income housing. So yeah, I would encourage people to get involved in some of those rezoning fights at the local level, at your local community board, borough president's office, so on and so forth. You know, I don't know if New York has ever really engaged with municipal budgetary issues, but New York City does devote a component of its municipal capital budget to directly subsidizing new affordable housing and new permanent supportive housing projects. So I think maybe sometime in the future we could get involved in the city's budgeting process and encourage the city council to allocate more capital subsidy to these projects, to these subsidized housing projects.
Yeah, we don't have enough, but I wanted to say that I don't know if you all had the ability, this for Open New York, to do a deep dive on the housing plan, the blueprint for housing and homelessness. If not, I would suggest starting there, so to speak, and then engaging the administration in such a way that you're able to, if there are things missing, things to improve upon, like what Bobby was saying, one important thing, we don't feel that the budget that they just passed, it provides enough for the development of housing. So these are things that we see from what has been presented, and then find ways to address those specific things that may be unaddressed and need to be really centered.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would want to add to that that, you know, based on the big survey that NYC Speaks, you know, that the mayor's ran recently, there are a lot of people in New York City, almost across the board, who agree specifically with the idea that increasing housing and housing affordability options can have a direct impact on public safety, right? This was something that was really surprising to me, that basically, you know, New York City residents were asked, you know, what's the number one thing that the city can do to address public, not just to address housing, but to address public safety issues in your area. And the number one thing was housing, add more housing, right? So I think people understand that homelessness is a housing issue. It's not a crime issue. And I think it ties into a sort of overarching abundant housing urbanist vision, in the sense that if you just give people housing, it costs less than trying to police them, trying to treat them in the emergency room, and trying to reach them once they've gone too far into mental illness and substance abuse that may have been brought on by their the trauma of being homeless and not necessarily have caused their homelessness. So it's cost effective as well. And it's better for society. It's better for all of us.
Yeah, and this is, I'm glad you said that, because in the hood, when we see the violence, gun violence, gang violence, so prevalent, one of the main things that we know is that a lot of these kids out here are either housing insecure or homeless. And sort of like the gangs and those lifestyles sort of becomes our survival mechanism and our way out, or we find sanctuary in these things that are just not conducive. They have that negative impact. And from my perspective, being a person chronically homeless since 10 years old, and having to deal with so much, you know, I literally can see in retrospect how that could be like almost like a never-ending cycle, you know. And then it at my age, it results in, which I didn't see this 3-4 years ago, but the health deterioration, the mental health deterioration, and all of those factors. And it's like, it's a huge difference now, but with me having my own key and being in my own house, it was a huge difference even being in the Lucerne than when I was, you know, out here in the streets or sleeping on people's couches and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was great, Olivia.
Yeah, you know, so I think transitioning from being chronically homeless to then having a place, it's, you know, it's a transformational experience, and is one that we need to make sure that we're able to support people in it.
Yeah, and it's challenging.
Oh, absolutely.
So there's an idea that even if you're not in need of, say, supportive housing, the idea of aftercare services, at least for a year, meaning having someone to connect with that might help you get a budget together and stuff like that. You know, with everything I do, sometimes, trust me, it took me about, I'm probably still not adjusted in my apartment, but there were some things that I just did not, I was like, wait a minute, I forgot how to shop. I forgot how to grocery shop, you know, and I had to call people like, how do you set up the shopping list? And I could imagine that that's the experience of so many people who have been chronically homeless.
Yeah, I think that's why those supportive services are so really need to be coupled with it. Well, this has been an amazing conversation. I know that we've been chatting for a while. Does anybody have any last comments to add before we close out this conversation?
I just want to thank Shams for joining us because, yes. I mean, you know, as Shams pointed out, you know, the folks who are directly experiencing homelessness are the ones who are the actual experts on this subject. And they are the ones that we need to listen to when we're setting policy. So, and it can be difficult and it can be traumatic to have to relive certain aspects of those in order to come and speak to folks about it. And so I always appreciate when Shams is willing to do that.
Yeah, thank you so much. I have learned a lot from you this evening, and I am very grateful for your time spending with us. And I know that you are very busy too.
And it's reciprocal, because for me it's healing, but it is always like doing interviews and all of this stuff. There's always a sort of like a triggering or traumatic, not really traumatic depending on the situation, but there's always something to it to kind of remind me of the pain or the struggle. But the reality also is that it allows me to confront them things in a safe space, in a positive way, and by contributing not just to my own development and growth and good, but to actually see another person like that benefits, then that's the biggest thing. And so, but this would never be possible if it were not, and is not. This would not go, if I said that right. This couldn't be possible without the support of the diverse group of people that are there for me, and that have been there for me. And so our collective interaction is where this real power comes from. No matter where you was born, what color, what religion, what gender, that collective action and engagement is what gives me the ability to do what I'm doing and to get the advocacy and all that stuff, but just to be a better member of society than I was, say, 3 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, that's the New York City experience, right? We all have to be there for each other, and that's just part of living here.
Yeah.
Well, and I know that you are on Twitter as the homeless hero, and you always keep it very real on Twitter. So I always enjoy seeing what you tweet on Twitter. Follow us on Twitter. We are at OpenNY for All on Twitter and Instagram, and our website is opennewyork.city. So please follow us on social media, become a member, and we look forward to working with anybody who wants to join us.